So I'd like to introduce Susan Greaney, Senior Properties Historian for English Heritage, but rather more importantly, a PhD candidate. I thought have you got it now?
No, not yet.
No,
I'm
I thought
afraid
you
not.
had. You've handed it in.
No, I haven't.
Oh, I thought you had.
No,
Oh.
sadly not. Being a part-time student means I'm not yet a doctor, but at some point, maybe later this year.
Won't be long, but you have won a prize for the research that you published in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society, which I think to do that before your doctorate is probably not bad.
Thank
It
you.
indicates perhaps you might not be you might be on track to get your doctorate.
Hopefully, yeah.
Okay, so big thanks to Sue for doing this.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. I can't believe quite how many people are on this call. But I wish I was there in person in the museum and delivering this talk to you. But unfortunately, because of the current times, I'm on Zoom. But that means we have a very large audience and lots of people from all over the place. So I hope you enjoy. So what as David has just said, I have sort of two hats. One is that I work for English Heritage, but the other is that I am currently a PhD student at Cardiff University. And the talk tonight is going to focus very much on that research. And what I'm going to talk about particularly is Mount Pleasant Henge in near the town of Dorchester in Dorset. And this is research that I've been undertaking as part of my PhD research and was published last year, as David just said, in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society. So I'll include a reference at the end to the paper in case you want to follow up all the juicy details in the published paper. So let's make a start. My PhD research is focused on monument complexes. What is a monument complex? It's a slightly strange term, and it's not really set. There's not really a definition of it, although I have made one up for my PhD. But in essence, in Britain and Ireland, during the Neolithic and into the early Bronze Age, we get these clusters of monuments, complexes of interrelated monuments that are built through the early Neolithic, the late Neolithic, and some continue on into the early Bronze Age. And in effect, they are small geographic clusters of different types of monuments, all located in a sort of small area. If I just go through some examples, these things will become a bit more familiar to you. So just to confuse you to start with, I'll talk about Dorchester, another Dorchester. This is Dorchester-on-Thames, where there's a very large complex centered around a cursus, and this monument here, which you can see in the top corner, which is the Big Rings Henge. Another example, Walton Basin in the middle of Wales in Powys, an amazing complex full of timber enclosures and lots of complicated monuments and the cursus. The Thornborough Henges up there in North Yorkshire, three very similar henge monuments and another cursus. This one for Teviot up in the lowlands of Scotland, big timber enclosure, and lots of other related monuments. And then perhaps a bit more familiar to everybody, monument complex at the Stennis Brodgar area in the heartland of Orkney, and the Bend of the Boyne as an example of one of the Irish clusters. So some of these are really well-known sites. Some of these are really well-preserved stone monuments that we class as World Heritage sites and like to take day trips to, or even longer holidays. But some of these are fairly unknown and are a bit hidden because the monuments have been built of timber and earth rather than the longer-lasting stone. Now, there's a cluster of these monument complexes which sit down in the area that we're all interested in, really, which is southern England, and particularly the counties of Dorset and Wiltshire and Somerset. And this cluster is a cluster of clusters, in a way, I guess we could say, but it's a particular concentration of these monument complexes in this area. We have monuments like the complex at Stanton Drew, just south of Bristol, where we've got stone circles and timber structures. Priddy on the Mendip Hills, which is becoming a monument complex now because of Jodie Lewis's work there, exploring many new monuments, including a timber circle, a causewayed enclosure, and these more famous, the henge circles at Priddy. We've got a huge number of monuments on Kremborn Chase, mostly centred around the centre of the Dorset cursus, the longest cursus monument, an early Neolithic monument in Britain. And of course, more famously, the Avebury complex, Marden in the Vale of Pewsey, and Stonehenge. Now, the one I'm going to focus on today is Dorchester. And this is just an example of a monument complex that I ended up looking at in more detail. My PhD focuses on several different case studies of monument complexes across Britain and Ireland, but at Dorchester, I felt that there was some research that I could do, primary new research that would help to try and understand these complexes. Now, the Dorchester Complex, don't worry too much at the moment about what all these blobs and symbols mean. I'm going to explain them a little bit later in the talk. But in essence, this is the cluster of monuments. They sit at the confluence of these two rivers. That's the River Frome to the north and the South Winterbourne to the south, which join together at a confluence and then flow off down into Poole Harbour. And the complex of monuments sort of sits in this triangle of land between these two rivers. The one we're going to focus on mostly today is this one. This is Mount Pleasant Henge. But in a bit later on in the talk, I'll come back and talk about all these other monuments and how they all fit together. But for now, we're just going to focus on this particular monument, which is built right at the end of what's known as the Arlington Ridge, which is this ridge of land that goes between the two rivers. So Mount Pleasant Henge is a monument that's built up of several components. It's not just one thing. There is the henge, so this is the earthwork enclosure. Here you've got a ditch and surrounded by a bank. Although the bank is missing to the north, it was probably there. It's been probably lost, mostly due to the plough. So the henge of Mount Pleasant is this enormous enclosure, and this is a ditch that's up to 4 meters deep and a corresponding bank, again 4 meters sort of high. This is chalk, so this would be a white ditch and a white bank. And there's some signs that there's an outer bank of some kind as well around parts of the circuit. So that's the henge. Within that sits this fenced palisade, this timber palisade, probably using about 1,600 tree trunks. These are large posts, and they're set in a continuous ditch. And there are some entrance posts which are absolutely enormous, great big socking timber posts that flank these quite narrow entrances. Two of them have been found during excavations. There are probably more around this part of the circuit, but they haven't been excavated yet. So that's the timber palisade. And then here at the centre of the site, actually on the highest point of the ground topographically, is what's known rather romantically as Site 4. Site 4 was a name given to it during the excavations. But this is quite a complicated concentric timber and stone monument. And we'll look at that in a slightly close-up view in a minute, surrounded by its own ditch. Other features that you can see on this map are, I've gone a bit forward. A Conquer Barrow, which is a mound, quite a large, again, sort of another 4 meters on top of the existing henge bank. There's some confusion about this Conquer Barrow and where it sits, but my preference is that it was built on top of the existing henge bank. If anyone's familiar with the monument of Arbor Low up in Derbyshire in the Peak District, there's a very similar pattern there where there's a large mound built on top of the henge bank. And we have this this feature here, which is something that's been identified on aerial photographs by Martin Barber as a sort of roadway or approach to the monument. It sort of leads off down towards the river where there's a fording point across the River Frome. So those are the key components of the monument. And the understanding was, based on excavations, which I'll come on to in a second, that this was a monument that was built over a relatively long period. So elements of it, in particular this palisade, were thought to be much later, were thought to be early Bronze Age, whereas the rest of it was thought to be probably Neolithic. So quite a kind of elongated period of construction and alteration and modification. This is the Site 4 monument that's in the centre of that monument. As you can see, it's concentric timber. All these blobs are timber posts. It's a little bit like Woodhenge or the Sanctuary, if any of you are familiar with those sites near Stonehenge and Avebury. It's quite an interesting one because it's actually arranged around these 4 sort of passageways that you can see. So it's almost like a compass, slightly off the cardinal points. So the timbers are arranged in a particular way, and set within the middle and also around the outside at certain points are some stones. These are sarsen stones that were set up in the centre here in something like a cove with 4 post holes at each corner. So a slightly strange arrangement, but reminiscent of other structures that we see at Neolithic monuments of this type. And then surrounded by a ditch, which I'll come back to in a bit. Ignore for now these complicated numbers and things. That's all of our dating evidence that we got, but I'll come back to what that all means later. Here's a photograph of Site 4 under excavation in 1971. This gives you a great impression of what the excavation was like. This was an excavation led by Geoffrey Wainwright, part of quite a big research campaign that he led in the late 1960s and early 70s at some of the major mega-henges, as in large enclosures like Mount Pleasant. So he excavated at Durrington Walls, and he excavated at Marden, and he also excavated here at Mount Pleasant. And his excavations are the major excavations that have taken place on the site, and there hasn't been any since. He was particularly looking to see whether this site was being damaged because it was under the plough at the time. Sadly, it still is under the plough today. So we do think it's a site that's sadly being eroded every time the tractor goes over it. But unfortunately, that's the case. But Geoff was also really interested in working out what these mega-henges were, what was going on within them, how were they, what was the sequence and construction, how were the ditches dug. And there's a great big lovely volume on Mount Pleasant that he published very quickly in 1979. Where you can go to for all of the juicy details of sections and exciting excavation plans. But this is the major piece of research that was done at Mount Pleasant. Here's an aerial photograph of the site taken in 1996. And this shows really well how some of the features of the monument show up in aerial photographs. You can see here the circular Site 4 ditch. You can see the main henge ditch going around here with its entrances. These white patches are the bank, the henge bank, and you might be able to just make out these thin lines. This is the palisade. These are the thin ditches that those palisade posts were set into. So it's a really enormous site. Unfortunately, this photograph rather focuses on the sewage works in the background, but actually it's much more pleasant than it looks in this photograph if you go and visit it. Now, what I was trying to do with my research was build up a chronology for the Dorchester Complex and in particular Mount Pleasant Henge. Why did I focus on this particular complex? Well, many of the other complexes that I talked about at the beginning of the talk have had recent excavations by both universities and commercial development-led archaeology. And many of them have got new geophysical surveys going on in them. So there's lots of new evidence, lots of new excavations, and lots of new dating all coming forward, which is great. Dorchester, really no one had touched for a long time. There was a gap there. There was something I could do which wasn't really being actively excavated at the time. So the first port of call was obviously the Dorset County Museum, who hold all of the excavation archive from Mount Pleasant, from Wainwright's excavations. And so that was the first thing to do, was to go and have a look what survived in the archive to see if there were suitable samples for radiocarbon dating. Now, very nicely, a lot of the boxes that hold the Mount Pleasant material have still got Geoff's name on them. You can see there, Mount Pleasant Excavations, care of the post office in Dorchester. So that was nice to see. I always quite like a box with some good kind of palimpsest of labels and things stuck on it. But at the time, he's working for the Ministry of Works, so this ends up being quite official looking stationery. My first visit to Dorset County Museum was initially a bit disappointing because I'd hoped to find lots of animal bones from the site. Now, when choosing material for radiocarbon dating, you want particular types of thing. And ideally, you want material that is related directly to events that you want to be able to pinpoint in time. Now, the best types of material are things like articulated animal bones. So animal bones found still in their anatomical positions, which you know have ended up in a ditch or a pit or a feature of some kind and have not been moved since the kind of meat or decayed off the bones. So I'd hoped that there would be some nice articulating animal bones from lots of different parts of the monument. Unfortunately, all of the animal bones in the boxes had at some point in the past, and we don't really know when, been jumbled up and had been assigned to rough period, and their context information, the really crucial detail about exactly where those bones had come from, was lost. So there was no way we could sample any of the animal bone because although much of it was probably Neolithic, we couldn't pinpoint exactly where it had come from in the site archive. However, there were lots and lots of antler picks, and this is one of the antler picks that we sampled. This is my colleague, Dr. Pete Marshall, who very kindly helped me to sample the material from this site and others. And here he is taking a very small section of a piece of antler pick off to be sent away to the labs for sampling. Antler picks are great because if they come from the very bottom of the ditch, from the very primary fills of a ditch or a pit, you can be pretty sure if they've got wear on them or if they look like they've been modified to be a pick, that they are related to the construction, the digging out of that feature. So we had lots of decent antler picks from the primary fills of the ditch and also from the fills of the Site 4 ditch. We had other material that we could date. We had some charcoal, some hazelnut shells and some short life charcoal, so small pieces of wood like branches that are not going to be kicking around for very long, from underneath the henge bank. And we also had some burials that were in the ditch, which turned out to be Iron Age, but they helped to also to constrain the sort of dates that we were getting from the Neolithic material. So we had antler picks, and we had also antler picks from the palisade ditch, so that fenced enclosure. We also had antler picks, and we had charcoal from the remains of the posts and from the remains of what looked to be burning of those posts in prehistory. So we had lots of nice samples. So we ended up obtaining another 39 samples to kind of build up a chronology of this site. I say another 39 because there were some existing dates. Wainwright had obtained quite a few early radiocarbon dates as part of the original excavation report, and those were still very good dates. There was nothing wrong with them, but we included those in our modelling when it came to the analysis. So here's one of the antler picks, and this is the kind of photograph that you take in the museum to show. You tend to take a before and after photograph, so you can show exactly which tiny section we've taken off, and you can see that these are very worn. These tips they're smoothed. They've clearly been used and been modified by taking off some of the tines to make them into decent tools for digging. Now, what you get back, as many people listening will know, but not everyone perhaps, when you send off a sample of bone or antler or charcoal to be radiocarbon dated, you get back a date, and that date isn't necessarily a calendar date. It's an uncalibrated date. So this chart here is what you end up with if you put your date through the software that allows you to look at it. And what the determination is, which is what the scientific process comes out, is how old that material is. What does the decay of carbon tell us? And this is the date that you get this red blob. It's a probability, so that's why it's that curve. And then what you have to do with that date is calibrate it. So there's a number of methods for doing this, but the main way we do it is using tree ring data. So this is what we call the calibration curve, which is made up of lots and lots of data from known age material, so tree rings particularly of known age, and they can be used to, in effect, calibrate this date to provide an actual calendar date. So that's what we call it, the calibrated date, or sometimes you'll see it written as Cal BC. So in this case, the radiocarbon determination comes out around about 4000 BP. It's that date there, 4016, with an error range of 30, and that translates into a radiocarbon date that's represented by this part of the graph here. So you end up with lots of these radiocarbon dates, and what we do now in archaeology is we combine all these radiocarbon dates with what we know about the archaeology of the site. So again, don't worry about this looks very complicated, I realise, but what you have to do for a site like Mount Pleasant is build up your knowledge of how that site formed, so the stratigraphy of that site, and you make sure that where you're looking at your radiocarbon dates, you are using that archaeological knowledge to help constrain those dates further. So instead of having quite a wide range of probability, you can basically get them down to quite narrow ranges. So that date I just showed you in the previous slide actually fits into this box here. We took actually 3 samples from that particular antler pick and sent them off to 3 different laboratories so that we make sure that we're 100% getting a decent, accurate date. So that date there sits in there. So we know that that date, whatever it comes out, has to be stratigraphically related to things below it and things above it. And so you can basically work out and constrain and narrow down that probability of where that date lies. And there's very clever software programs called Oxcal and other ones are available to put all this through, work out the maths, and gives you a much more accurate model. And what you end up with is another equally complicated diagram, but looks a little bit like this, which gives you your dates. And you can see, I don't know if you can work out, if you've got small screens, you might not be able to see, but here, if you might be able to just make out that there's a black solid patch of this graph, and then there's an outline bit. The outline bit is the original date, that wide date, and what we've done is narrow it down to that black bit by saying it's the same date as all of these other things, or it's in relation to other dates before and after. So that means as archaeologists now, we can, with enough dates and with good samples, good context information, good, particularly, digging tools like antler picks or charcoal that comes directly from posts, we can narrow down to, within 25 years quite easily for pinpointing a date of an event that happened on a monument or a settlement site. This is perhaps an easier way of understanding it. So what we did once we've had all those samples back, and we'd analysed them all and put them all through this clever software. And this is what we ended up with. And this shows that the henge, this green part, the henge earthwork, the bank and ditch, was built first. So that was the first major construction activity to happen on this site. Relatively shortly afterwards, maybe somewhere in the range of 100 years, the palisade and the Conquer Barrow seem to have been built. So the Conquer Barrow is represented by this pink colour and the palisade is this blue colour. You can see that they overlap quite a lot, so potentially they're the same date-ish. So those come a little bit later, and then slightly later again you have this purple area, which is the digging of that Site 4 ditch. So you've got a sequence here, but it's a relatively short time period. We're talking within about 120 years, 125 years, that it's probable that most of these activities happen. So all the components of that quite complicated monument were built within the time span of a few generations, within certainly living, certainly the memory of parents and grandparents. It's not something that happens over thousands of years, and it's certainly not something that continues on into the early Bronze Age. So with this, we were able to say that the children, or perhaps the grandchildren of those people who dug the henge enclosure, were the people who decided to build the palisade, the fence palisade. So that gives you a really good impression of what kind of time period we're talking about. If we think a generation is roughly around 25 years, then these are really short time periods, really, for thinking about how these people interacted with this monument and modified it and changed it over time. So I've simplified this a little bit. One of the things to bear in mind is that the Site 4 ditch we managed to date with samples, but the actual timber monument itself, there wasn't any suitable samples available for. And it is quite likely that that Site 4 ditch was dug around the existing monument. So the actual timber post, that concentric post monument, might well be the same date as the palisade or the Conquer Barrow. Based on comparison with other sites, like for example Woodhenge, we know that the ditch was often dug a little bit later to enclose an earlier monument. Okay, and then this shows it even more simply in that this is the different phases of the monument as we understand them now. So as I said, first we have the henge earthwork being built, then we have the palisade being built inside and the Conquer Barrow being added, and then later on we have the Site 4 ditch. These have been kind of coloured up in transparency to show the probability of those things being dug and being constructed at that particular time. Now, Mount Pleasant doesn't last that long. It suffers a bit. The palisade itself, the timber palisade made up of all those tree trunks, is burnt down. And the black sections of the palisade here are parts of it where we know that the posts were intensely burnt in a fire. The grey parts of the enclosure were, the posts were actually removed, or they decayed in situ. So it wasn't a complete destruction of the site, but it was a major event in the history of the monument. Now, we don't know whether that was planned from the outset. It may have been that they built the timber monument in order to burn it down. It may have been some sort of slighting or attack on this monument. It may be a part of the rituals that took place at the site. It's very difficult to know for sure, but it did take place only a century or so after they'd been put up, so relatively shortly after they'd been erected. Those posts that were not burnt, if they stood in place, may well have taken quite some time to decay, particularly those enormous entrance posts. There's some calculations you can do about how long a post will stand up for, you know, if it's just left alone. As any of you know who've built a fence posts tend to rot off at the ground level, and that's the same with these timber posts. So this would be a site that for several centuries was a scene of falling timber posts and decaying timber lying on the ground probably. So quite a kind of dramatic and active monument for some time after this burning episode had taken place. And interestingly, also at the end of the life of the monument, in the site for ditch, it appears that those stones that made up the central feature and some of those external features were broken up. There's a layer in the ditch which is full of burnt and broken sarsen stone, and with that some beaker pottery, which is early Bronze Age pottery. And so again, it appears that perhaps there's some deliberate destruction going on, that perhaps the stones are being removed from that monument, and that there are changes taking place to that monument, perhaps as a deliberate attack or deliberate slighting of the sort of sacredness of that inner space, that inner sanctum. Now, that destruction, we know from the dates, we've been able to date that layer with the beaker pottery in it, and it shows that that destruction took place really quite shortly after the very earliest beaker burials were buried in southern England. So we know that that's a time when we know from ancient DNA studies in particular that there is a major flux in population, that people are coming into southern Britain from continental Europe, and you know, could those new people have come and attacked a sacred site, or was it some kind of deliberate dismantling of this stone circle by the people who built it? We don't know, but with this really precise chronology, we can start to ask those really precise questions about exactly what the social relations are at these major monument sites at the time that these new people are arriving in southern Britain. So here's a more recent aerial photograph of Mount Pleasant Henge. This is upside down from the one you saw before. But again, you can see how clearly those features, the ditch and bank and the palisade, show up within the crop marks there. It's a site that I would dearly like to see taken out of the plough. Many of you will know that another major mega-henge site, which Wainwright also excavated at Durrington Walls, has a very similar set of evidence, but also in more recent excavations led by Mike Parker Pearson and the Stonehenge Riverside Project, evidence for a major settlement. So houses, feasting, lots and lots of occupation debris. Now, it's quite probable that there's similar evidence here. We haven't found it yet, but I would suspect that perhaps under the henge bank there may well be preserved evidence for occupation, and we certainly know that feasting was taking place here, and there was a lot of animal bones, particularly, for example, in the palisade ditch. So it's probably, if you imagine, it's a similar type of site. It's a similar site where people are feasting and congregating in probably quite large numbers within this henge complex. But of course, we have not yet been able to find the houses, and it may well be that the evidence is being sadly lost as the site continues to be ploughed. Okay, so that's Mount Pleasant Henge. That's the detail of the chronology and what I was trying to do in building a much more accurate picture of what was going on at that particular monument. But now let's zoom out a bit and look at the complex in a bit more detail. Go back to this image. So we've been looking at Mount Pleasant here at the eastern side of the complex. But now what I'll do is take you on a bit of a tour of the rest of the complex. Now, my PhD research has also been obtaining new chronologies, new dating for all the other major monuments in this complex. I haven't published those yet, and I'm not going to take you through the really specific details of that dating evidence because we're still working on it and it's still kind of in flux, but that will come soon. But in essence, what I'm showing you today is the results of that work. So let's start in the early Neolithic. The stars that you can see on this map are evidence for settlement and mostly pits. So these are I haven't marked on this map sort of general flint scatters, which tend to be our main evidence for occupation in this period. But where you've got the stars, there are actual pits, which tend to be the evidence that we have left for where people are actually living, or at least digging holes and putting things like animal bones and pottery in the ground. So you can see there's actually quite intensive occupation of this area in the early Neolithic period. So this is between, say, 4000 BC and 3500 BC. We've also got some major monuments. This one down here is the famous monument of Maiden Castle. Many of you will be familiar with this site. Obviously a major and very lovely Iron Age hill fort, but underneath one end of it, this end, is an equally important early Neolithic causewayed enclosure. So that's a major focus of occupation and ritual activity in the early Neolithic. You've also got several long barrows. These are the oval shapes you can see in this image, and a slightly strange monument which is known as Arlington Avenue, located not far from Mount Pleasant. It's two parallel ditches, 75 meters in length. It's been variously described as a long barrow or a long enclosure, or even a short cursus monument. So cursus monuments I've mentioned a few times at the beginning of the talk are these enormously long rectangular enclosures dating from the early Neolithic. I tend to quite like the term long enclosure because there's no sign of a mound here. There's no sign of any funerary activity, that we don't have any burials from this site that might indicate it was a long barrow. But we have got new dates from this site which show it is clearly a sort of mid 4th millennium, 3500 BC-ish monument constructed. And it's really the first monument that accentuates this east-west ridge, the Arlington Ridge. Then we jump forward into the Middle Neolithic. Now, you can see there's a lot less blobs appearing on the map. Really, there's not that much evidence of things going on. We've got a little bit more settlement. Another star appears there, a site with some Peterborough ware pottery. But the major monument that gets constructed is known as Flagstone's enclosure. And those of you who know it, it sits underneath Max Gate, Thomas Hardy's house at National Trust property in Dorchester. This is the site here. Max Gate is this building here. And this is under excavation during the construction of the Dorchester bypass in the 1980s. And you can see just about, sorry, it's a slightly overexposed picture, but you can see this arc of pits. This is one half of the circle, which is this monument here. It's a monument that's very, very similar to the earliest phase of Stonehenge, the henge earthwork surrounding Stonehenge, and quite similar to some of those other monuments I showed earlier, pretty circles, for example. It's an early type of henge. Some people call it a proto-henge. And it's a funerary monument. So it's used for the, not a huge number of people, but then only half has been excavated. So burials of children and cremations of adults. And this site roughly dates to around about 3200 BC. We've dated both the human remains, the cremations, and antler picks from this site. So it seems to be a monument that's built in this Middle Neolithic period, between this sort of quite intense activity that happens in the early Neolithic and the incredibly kind of intense activity that happens in the late Neolithic. So it's a really important monument, and it's got really interesting parallels with other major sites like Stonehenge and with another one in North Wales called Llandagai. And this is by far the earliest of those of this type at the moment. So it could be the first one, or it could be that perhaps our dating at the other ones isn't quite showing up that early activity. But 3200 BC is roughly when that one is built. I know you won't be able to read this, so don't worry. overstretch your eyes trying to look at what this says. What I've just represented here is just a graph showing that activity. So the purple blobs here are dates, radiocarbon dated sites from the early Neolithic, so those occupation sites, the settlement sites, Maiden Castle and Arlington Avenue, all sitting here in the early Neolithic. Then you've got one blob here, one event here, which is the Flagstone's enclosure being constructed. And then you have this enormous gap of pretty much 700 years before the major monuments of the late Neolithic are constructed, including Mount Pleasant Henge that we've just been talking about. So this is really interesting. And this is what I was trying to do with my research, was map out what is the chronology of these monument complexes over time. And where you might think that it's fairly continuous activity where a site gets repeated use again and again, actually what we see is that there are some long periods where nothing is necessarily being constructed. It doesn't mean that nothing's happening there. It doesn't mean that people aren't visiting the site or being settled in the area or even using the monuments, but it does show that nothing is being constructed, at least as far as we know from our current excavations and evidence. But then you get this huge kind of madness of late Neolithic activity right at the end. So in the late Neolithic, we get the construction of Mornbury Rings, fantastic earthwork monuments. Many of you are very familiar with it, I'm sure, next to the station in Dorchester. Really extraordinary monument. In about 45 incredibly deep shafts, which were dug down from the bottom of the ditch here within the monument. Our dating shows that that's really late in the late Neolithic, so it's roughly 2400 BC, just again at that cusp of time when these new people are coming in from the continent and the new big pottery is arriving. Greyhound Yard, which is an enormous timber palisaded enclosure, quite similar to the one that sits within Mount Pleasant, but further down the river and enclosing a dry valley that goes down to the river. Only part of this site has been excavated. This is a photograph of the ones that are underneath the Waitrose car park in Dorchester. If any of you shop in Waitrose, you may have spotted that there are some red timber discs, sorry, not timber, red concrete discs on the floor of the car park. If you haven't seen them, have a look next time you go. Those mark out where these post holes were found, and here you can see them being excavated. These are the post holes, and then there are ramps where they've slid in enormous timbers and put them upright. This again it's a very similar date to the one that's built at Mount Pleasant. It's around about 2500 BC. So we've got two major monuments being built alongside each other at this time. And we've got Mount Pleasant, which I was talking to you about before, which has obviously got several components to it, but is roughly 2500 BC as well. So huge amounts of activity going on, really big, monumental, lots of effort, lots of people, construction projects that are happening at this time. It's a kind of intense activity. So there we have a kind of built up picture of the monument complex of Dorchester. And what we can do with that information is think about how people were thinking about this landscape, how they were moving around this landscape. And in particular, what's interesting at this site is you've got early Neolithic activity here in purple, and you've got some of these monuments start to focus on this end ridge. You've got the Arlington Avenue long enclosure and flagstones, but these monuments would have been old, would have been 600, 700 years old by the time these other monuments were built around them. And yet these other monuments seem to have been built almost to surround them, very close to. What's interesting is that Flagstone seems to have been avoided in the late Neolithic. There's not much evidence that people were there. There's no pottery. There's not much evidence that people were frequenting the site. So perhaps it was seen as a sacred place that was not visited or not suitable for deposition of objects. But people must have had to walk around these monuments to get to and traverse between these other monuments that were being built. So it's really interesting to think about what did flagstones mean to those people, and after 600, 700 years, did they remember that it was what its purpose was? Did they remember it was a burial site? Did they just see that the earthwork humps and bumps in the ground and think it was the work of mythical ancestors or some people who came before them? Who knows? But it seems that the presence of flagstones in the middle Neolithic almost cause it, it's an impetus, it's a reason for building the late Neolithic monuments where they are. So we can talk in a bit more detail about how this monument complex evolves over time. But we can also do something once we've built up those chronologies, and I'm not saying that such detailed chronologies exist for every monument complex, but we will get there. There's lots of people working on all this all across the country, is that we can start to build up comparisons and to compare and contrast with what's happening at other monument complexes. Now at Dorchester in Mount Pleasant, you've got this mega-henge and the palisaded enclosure being built, but those enclosures are found all across Britain and Ireland. And what it's looking like is that the dating from several of those enclosures that have now been well dated is that they all are roughly the same date. They're round about that 2500 BC mark. Now in the south, they tend to be earthwork mega-henges. Think of Mount Pleasant, Darrington Walls. Further north, they tend to be timber palisaded enclosures like that one I showed you at Fort Eviat. To my mind, they're the same thing. They're just built of a different material. They tend to be located near rivers. And they tend to enclose other smaller monuments inside them, small henges and cremation cemeteries, for example. And there are also some timber ones. We now know that there are the timber ones at Mount Pleasant and at Greyhound Yard, but at Darrington Walls, recent excavations have also shown that timber, there was a timber monument there, which was very shortly replaced by an earthwork henge. So these are similar monuments. So once we've got some decent chronologies, we can start to compare and look at how people across Britain and Ireland were connected, how these particular places people were doing very similar things, similar sorts of monument construction, but also similar types of rituals, similar types of ways of treating their dead, and similar types of material culture, so similar types of pottery. So that suggests to us that people are communicating over relatively long distances between particular parts of Britain and Ireland. And that has all kinds of interesting connotations for travel and connections, and others have written about this much more than I have, but it gives us a sense of what's happening across quite large parts of the British Isles. So why is this important? Why am I trying to do detailed chronological work for these complexes? So what we're trying to do really is try and think about how society was organized and who are the people who are doing this building work. Now, this is an old 1980s Ivan Lapper painting of the construction of Stonehenge. And you see here that you have a chap in charge here with his bush barrow regalia. Many of you will recognize this is a bush barrow, the mace head and the gold attachments from the bush barrow. And he's obviously in charge. He's there directing, telling everyone else what to do. Everyone else, poor people, are laboring away. It does seem to be mostly men on it as a child, laboring away on building the monument. And we have to go back to somebody like Richard Atkinson, who, when he was writing about Stonehenge in 1960, said, "I believe that Stonehenge itself is evidence for the concentration of political power, for a time at least, in the hands of a single man," had to be a man, didn't it, "who alone could create and maintain the conditions necessary for this great undertaking." And moving forward a little bit more, how do we think about these monument complexes? This is Colin Renfrew, and he wrote very famously about these monument complexes in Wessex. And he thought these clusters of monuments were representing chiefdoms, and that these chiefdoms each had their own monument complex, and that over time they coalesced, in effect, arriving at an overarching chiefdom whose kind of headquarters was Stonehenge. Now, the idea of chiefdoms can be challenged in lots of different ways, and there are many, many societies across the world that we know of that build megalithic and earth monuments that do not necessarily have hierarchical or really stratified societies. So just the presence of monuments doesn't necessarily mean that we have to assume that such hierarchies or chiefs or leaders existed. Not saying they didn't have to be organized and have certain people who did certain roles, but it's not necessarily the case that we have to look for chiefdoms, or in Atkinson's case, a single man. We've come quite a long way from some of these ideas. But in more recent times, archaeologists have talked about these monuments as in two different ways. One is in terms of competition. So I'm using here, this is a relatively recent reconstruction drawing that I've just commissioned for some work at English Heritage to show the construction of the final phase of Silbury Hill. And the idea is here that some archaeologists have argued that these complexes are competitive with each other. You know, one builds a particularly spectacular henge, the other one answers with a very elaborate stone circle, and someone answers with a monumental mound like Silbury Hill. It's a kind of competitive element. So there's this idea of competition between different groups, but that assumes that people who are building these monuments live in the local area, and they are sort of self-contained social groups that identify with each of these sites. Now, we know from evidence from animal bones in particular, from Durrington, from Marden, from Mount Pleasant, that people were probably travelling over quite some distances to come to feasts, bringing their animals with them, at least from across southern Britain, if not further. So that doesn't necessarily hold water, that the idea that these people are living and building monuments on their doorstep. So it's quite difficult to understand how that might work as a competitive aspect. Other archaeologists have argued that these monuments are about collaboration. And of course they are, in terms of people working together and organising together to build and construct. But more specifically, Mike Parker Pearson, for example, has argued that Stonehenge is a unification monument to people, you know, combining the Welsh bluestones with the local Wiltshire sarsen stones, and representing a kind of unification of people from two different areas and two different kind of backgrounds. And Colin Richards has argued similar things for the Orcadian stone circles, about people bringing their stone from their local area and all working together to collaborate on projects. So that's a nice idea, but again, it sort of assumes that people are still living near, or have ancestry at least, in the areas where they're building these monuments. So I mean, I haven't got kind of definite answers to this yet, but I do think there's a key in establishing these really detailed chronologies, because you can't start to talk about competition and kind of collaboration without knowing the details of exactly what was constructed when. Now, it looks like a lot of these major monuments are being built at a very, very similar time, so that there must, I imagine, if I had a time machine, I'd definitely set it to 2500 BC, and I'd rush around all these complexes and work out what on earth are they doing. So much effort, so much, almost a frenzy of activity went into building monuments at that late Neolithic period, that 2500 BC time. So what was it that made people in lots of different parts of Britain and Ireland have that major frenzy of building activity? And as I said earlier, this is just before the arrival of new people from the continent, with their new beaker pottery and their new metals and their new ways of burying the dead, and probably their new religious beliefs and their new languages. So is the construction of these monuments a kind of reaction to that? Are people kind of doubling down and doing what they know even bigger and even more effortful? Is it that they have to build monuments to their gods to ensure that this slightly worrying on the horizon incoming people, you know, don't take over or don't upset the balance of society? Or is it that actually this frenzy of building activity and this kind of emulation and ever increasingly difficult and time-consuming monuments actually causes some kind of collapse? You can imagine that if people are having time away from their families and their farming and their day-to-day living to help these major construction projects, you can imagine that at some point maybe people start to get a bit disengaged with it and think, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go off, and I don't see the point in doing this thing. It's not bringing what we want anyway from our gods or from our what we expected to happen. And so maybe there's some sort of collapse in society. Maybe if there is a leadership, it dissolves in some way. People start saying, no, actually, I think I've done enough building monuments. Thanks very much. I'm going to have a holiday. Is there some sort of vacuum that means that there is the ability for people to then come in from the continent into that power vacuum and start to kind of arrive in the area and start to live and build their own monuments of different types? So this 2500 BC period, to me, is just really interesting. It's that kind of pivotal turning point in prehistory. There's so much going on in that period, and it's really only by constructing these detailed chronologies, looking at both the construction and use and in some cases abandonment of monuments, and comparing that to the very earliest dates for the beaker burials, that we can start to construct a detailed narrative for what's going on in this really crucial period. And we can then sort of try and write better histories of what's going on and what people are doing at this time. So this is a start. Mount Pleasant is a first bit, and
Hello, good evening, everyone. It looks as though we've just lost Sue, just at the critical point, I think, just as she was finishing off. So hopefully she'll rejoin us again in a moment or two. And it's a good time to start thinking of all the questions you want to ask. We've got 8 questions, so the questions are coming in at a rate of knots, which is great. So hopefully she'll rejoin us in just a moment. Hopefully she hasn't had the same power cut that we had in Wiltshire yesterday, which apparently took the power out for about for most of the day. Hopefully she'll be back.
I'm really sorry, I disappeared. I don't know what happened there.
Welcome back.
Sorry, when did you lose me?
You were just in rounding off, saying how you've done your time machine. You really want, and how the chronologies that chronology had established for Mount Pleasant, really to match by other sites to build up a picture.
Okay, shall I just do my thank yous at the end, shall I, and just finish off? I'm so sorry.
I think so.
I noticed that I'd disappeared for some reason. Anyway, let me just try and share again, and I'll just do my thank you slides. Right, okay, hopefully I've stayed in one place. So yes, I'm hoping you saw my final slide, which was about how we can only really understand this really pivotal period around 2500 BC by constructing detailed chronologies for the monuments, for their construction and their use and their abandonment, and also then comparing that to the dates that we have for the earliest beaker burials, and that major change, that major tipping point in prehistory. So this is a project. My contribution is fairly small, Mount Pleasant and the other Dorchester monuments. There are lots of other people who are working on building chronologies. People may well be familiar with other projects that have built amazing chronologies for early Neolithic monuments, and now really attention is turning to these later Neolithic monuments. So the work is really only just beginning. So thank you very much. I will just do a few thank yous. This is a photograph of the original Mount Pleasant excavation team. So thank you to them, because without their records and their diligent work, we wouldn't have the ability to go back to the archive and select the samples for the radiocarbon dating. Thank you to Dorset County Museum, to the curators and staff and the volunteers there who allowed us access to the archive, gave us permission to sample the material from the archive, and were very helpful at all stages of the project. Thank you to the Arts and Humanities Research Council who funded my PhD. Thank you very much to Historic England who funded the specific radiocarbon dates, and a special thank you to Peter Marshall who assisted with the sampling and trained me in Bayesian analysis and Oxcal. I'm not sure he's done a brilliant job, but he tried his best. And if anybody wants to read the paper, that's the reference there. I'm sure we could put it in the chat in case people want to copy and paste it. But if you just Google for tempo of a mega-henge or look up the proceedings of Prehistoric Society, you'll find it. Thank you.
Well, that was a fantastic talk, Susan, and to get that detailed chronology of a site is just astounding. And for me, it just raises all sorts of questions, as I'm sure, as I can see it does for other people.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then is that a good idea?
It probably is.
Cool. Right. Okay.
Right. Fabulous. So we'll start with Emma, because I was trying to clarify something with her from her question, but she said, regarding the chronology of construction, the potential gap of 700 years at the Dorchester group, what are the parallels with the chronology at the Kremborn Chase Monument Complex?
Oh, that's
I
a really good question.
assume she means the Dorset cursus and
Yes,
sixpenny
yes.
Handley.
So I am currently, and this is the final stage of my PhD, doing exactly those diagrams for all of the complexes. And I've done them for all of them except for Stonehenge and Cranbourne Chase. So I can't actually give you the answer. There is not that same gap at all of the complexes, that's for sure. At other complexes, well, particularly the Scottish and Irish ones, there's a very, very different picture about what's happening with kind of major construction happening in the Middle Neolithic period. And unfortunately for Cranbourne Chase, the radiocarbon dating, although we've got a few dates, then it's not as extensive as what we have for Dorchester. So it's a little bit less easy to tell what's going on in terms of the kind of peaks and troughs and the ebb and flow of activity. But certainly at sites like the Avebury complex, you do see a very similar drop off in the level of activity in the Middle Neolithic, and a similar sort of frenzy, as you like, at the end in the Late Neolithic. So it's a pattern that is replicated, at least I think, in the southern major complexes, although there's still some more work to be done on that. And if we can build up better chronologies for some of those other complexes, then we'll get closer to some answers about that.
Can I, perhaps if I can put a question in that sort of almost follows from that, being my small obsession, which is probably rather obvious, which is I'm really struck by the date, the 2500 date, which of course is when the Sarsens go up at Stonehenge and when beakers arrive. You know, and you speculated slightly on that, but it's really, really interesting that in that sort of couple of hundred years, each side of 2500 BC, the changes are just astounding.
Yeah. So I think the earliest beaker burials model for southern England come out a little bit later than that. So they're sort of 2400, 2350. So you've got a bit of a gap between the really, really intense building projects. There are some monuments like Silbury Hill, which do seem to be built right at the point of that. There's an overlap, there's a crossover. And yes, it is a really interesting area. There's some, you had a talk by Tom Booth recently. He touched on his recent work looking at the DNA of some of the people who are buried in some of the earliest beaker burials and round barrows in the Stonehenge landscape. And that's really exciting because that's showing that what's happening with those two groups suggests that perhaps there are groups of people who are not necessarily intermarrying straight away, and that they're sort of keeping a bit separate from each other. So there's an overlap there. Yeah, to be on a fly on the wall at that point would be just so fascinating to know what's happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sarah said, have you looked at the ability now to date pottery and looking at grooved ware dates?
That's really interesting. I mean, that's a very, very new technique. It's just coming on board as a new thing. You may have seen there's a nice article in the recent British Archaeology magazine about it. That wasn't a technique that was available when we were selecting samples only 4 years ago. So these things are evolving all of the time. That pottery dating is kind of game changing, really, because for the first time we can now directly date pottery. What I don't know, actually, is a good question, is whether there would be some pottery from the Site 4 post holes that might help us date that part of the monument more precisely. I have a feeling they're all quite small post holes and there's not much in them, but that would be a possibility. It'd be worth. There is certainly lots and lots of pottery in the archive there, looked after by Dorset Museum, and there's potential there in the future to go back, certainly. Yeah.
And you know, sorry, I was also going to say about your you know, you making the point that museums hold these archives which are the, you know, fruitful for future research. You don't have to dig holes in the ground to create groundbreaking research, which is real sort of tick in the box for museum archives.
And that's why that's why it's so important that we fund our museums properly and we look after them properly, because you know they're a treasure trove of material, and you never know what's going to happen with these new techniques in the future, that you know suddenly we can date pottery or the next thing. So yeah, I mean, thank you to Dorset Museum for looking after that material since 1970 on our behalf, because really it's only with the really detailed excavation records and context information that we can do this kind of work.
Yeah, we've had Pete Marshall playing with some stuff from some of our sites as well. So yeah, absolutely. Sean has asked, I think going back to that 700-year gap, she's asking if there's any evidence of climate change. Did anything like that may have had an impact?
There is slight climate is quite difficult in this period. Generally, it's sort of a bit 1 degree or so warmer than now and a bit wetter is what my understanding of it is. There are no major shifts in that period that I'm aware of anyway. There are shifts a bit earlier in that in general, in the early Neolithic, when people start to farm and start to grow crops and animals, there's a kind of peak when people are growing quite a lot of cereals, and then they switch to a much more pastoral economy when the mainstay of livelihood seems to be moving around with your herds of cattle and pigs. And so there is a distinct shift around that time, which is a bit earlier. That's sort of the start of the Middle Neolithic in effect. And that may be to do with climate change, but it may also to be things like disease in crops or potentially some kind of sickness that people have, or so many different reasons why we're thinking of pandemics at the moment that things stop or at least reduce in intensity in terms of what people are doing with their energy. So yeah, the climate change I don't think is probably the answer. I think there's probably wider societal changes. It may be one factor in terms of, we always think that kind of monuments are the thing that you do once you've got enough time and energy and you've established your farming quite successfully and you've got the time to do things. But I don't know, it's a bit too simplistic, I think, just to look for climate change as a driving factor. So yeah, not really got an answer there, but
And Sarah has asked, isn't it very difficult to burn large timber posts, especially under the ground? Now, before you answer that, I can't remember for the life of me what the dates are for the palisaded enclosures at West Kennet and whether the dates of that are similar, because I know Josh was suggesting, you had to try really hard to burn these things.
Yes, the West Kennet palisaded enclosures are currently dated in the most recent dating that was done in Alistair Whittle's Festschrift volume to the Middle Neolithic. So the dates on the charcoal all came out around 3,500 BC, I think, but all the dates on the animal bones, so all the feasting evidence and all the pig bones, came out at 2,500 BC. So we've got a big issue with that site at the moment, and the fingers crossed Josh's recent excavations at that site will have obtained lots of new dating samples, and there'll be a whole new round of dating for that site, because it's the one palisaded enclosure that doesn't currently fall at that 2,500 BC mark. And I'm pretty sure it does. It's so similar to the Mount Pleasant one. They're like peas in a pod. So there's something weird going on with the charcoal dates from West Kennet, and I don't think we quite understand what it is yet, but I'm hoping that Josh's work will produce some better dates that we can rely on a bit more.
But the detail of the question was whether, how easy would it have been to set those timber posts alight?
Sorry, I didn't answer the question, did I?
Sorry,
no, it's a really good question because
I'm butting in with too many questions myself.
No, it's a really good question. So when the posts, what you end up with when you dig one of these post holes is you get what I referred to, I think, in the report as kind of festoons of charcoal. So charcoal that goes all the way down. Now, is that somebody having an intense fire? And would that be able to burn the timber right down below ground? Or is that a post that has been charred deliberately before it's been set up in the ground? People in the past have suggested that people might char the base of posts in order for the monument to last longer. So if they're charring it, it wouldn't rot so quickly. But actually, you don't need to char the very end of a post. You actually have to char the bit where it's at ground level, because that's where it will rot. So the jury's out, basically, on whether these are posts that are deliberately burnt before they're put up, or whether there's a fire. Now, there is in the top of the palisade trench a lot of charcoal and a lot of burning evidence, and it's all different species. I should have said the posts are all oak. So in the top of that trench is a whole load of like hazel, and it looks like there's fuel basically for burning the palisade being imported and set fire to. So there is intense burning, and there is a destruction or a fire event that takes place there. But whether it will be intense enough to go below the ground, I don't know. Kenny Brophy has done some experiments. He has a project called Build and Burn, which involves building a timber palisade and then setting fire to it and seeing what happens. So I'm hoping that he might do some more of that soon, because he's been looking at this question about whether it's possible to burn something so intensely that it burns all the way down to the base of the post. But yeah, in my published article, I actually reproduced a picture of David Nash, who's an artist who works with wood. He created a piece of art that's an entirely charred post, and I suggested that if you charred an entire post and it was black and you stood it up against a white chalk henge bank, it would look very dramatic, and it would have a very, it would be a very exciting and interesting space to enter. So maybe if they're charring it, they're just doing it for visual effect. Who knows? Yeah, it's a big load of questions.
But the mix of wood suggests it's very much a
yeah,
deliberate burn.
Yeah, that fuel in the top, and that's what we've dated. That there was a charcoal date from that fuel material, which was what Wainwright actually had, and that's why he thought it was an early Bronze Age palisade. But it seems to be from this later destruction event. Yeah.
Okay. Ben Ford has asked, what role do you think the river plays alongside the sites at Dorchester?
Really good question. Not quite sure. All of these monuments, these enclosures, whether they're sort of henge enclosures or palisaded ones, appear to be very close to rivers. And many of them, we now know that Durrington has a sort of roadway or avenue that connects it to the River Avon. And we have this feature, this entrance approach that's been identified at Mount Pleasant, which also looks like it attaches itself to the river. Now, whether that's simply a practical routeway, people are literally traveling by boat and using that as a way to access the monument, or whether it's some sort of connection in that you have to connect your ritual monument to a source of water and to the rivers that flow, because it's a source of energy, or because it's somehow connected to your belief system that water is pure, or there's all kinds of things you could think about. I mean, Mike Parker Pearson has written particularly about how he associates the River Avon in the Stonehenge landscape with the sort of journey of the ancestors. But yeah, there's one key thing, is that we pretty much don't know what people are doing with their dead in that late Neolithic period. And the most likely thing that they're doing with their dead is cremating them and probably sticking them in rivers. It's our best guess at the moment, because the way that they're treating their dead, they're not leaving behind things that we can find archaeologically. So if you're putting your dead in rivers, maybe, I guess, but might be quite likely, then maybe rivers are kind of very important in those rituals, and maybe that's the connection. But it's a bit speculative, I'm afraid. There's not a definite understanding of how the people understood rivers at the time.
Okay. Stephen's asked an interesting one, or sort of two in one. What date would you say the Neolithic ends? That's number one. And number two, the follow-up, might the end be at different dates in the different complexes?
Oh yeah, really good point. Yes, I think, yes, definitely, you're right. I think it ends in different places at different times. There is some debate whether southern England in particular has what we call the Chalcolithic, which is the Copper Age, which is this sort of transition period between the late Neolithic, the Stone Age, and the early Bronze Age. And it's a period when we get our earliest beaker burials with gold and copper rather than bronze. And so we definitely have a transition period of several hundred years. And I would say that transition sort of starts around 2400, 2450, something like that, and probably continues to about 2200 or something. Sorry, I'm plucking these slightly out of the air, but there's a transition period, and it definitely happens at different times in different places across Britain and Ireland. I think certainly in the Avebury complex, it looks like things go on a little bit later in terms of them building Neolithic monuments. So particularly the construction of Silbury Hill seems to be relatively late compared to, say, the Dorchester or the Stonehenge areas. And there aren't that many early beaker burials from the Avebury landscape either. There's a lot of early beaker burials in the Dorchester area and also in the Stonehenge area. So I don't want to call it a backwater, but like, are the people in Avebury sticking out a bit longer because they're a bit further north, or they're a bit more isolated somehow? I've just called them the people of Avebury, and that's something I argued entirely against in my talk. But it's definitely a transition period, and that transition happens at different rates.
Okay. Tim has asked whether there's any astronomical alignments at Mount Pleasant or the monuments in the area.
Not that I know of in terms of precise alignments to something like the solstice. However, that site 4 that I showed the picture of, that concentric arrangement of timber posts, those avenues are slightly off the cardinal points. And that's a pattern, that kind of quartering pattern is seen at a number of monuments. It's seen at Avebury Henge, for example, if the entrances at Avebury Henge are also just slightly off the cardinal points. And a number of other monuments like the sanctuary at Avebury have also got that similar layout. So I think there's something in the architecture which is pointing towards a kind of a cosmology which incorporates quartering, and that incorporates kind of solstice alignments, as in these are directions, the key directions and the key ways to orientate monuments. But there are no, as far as I'm aware, nobody's argued, and I don't think I've picked up on any precise alignments. Yeah, Stonehenge is very unusual in that respect, in that complex around Stonehenge has some precise alignments, but it's not really found elsewhere at other complexes in southern England.
Okay, thanks. And Suzanne has said, Wainwright's excavations seem to be pretty well total of the henge. I wonder if that such a total excavation would be done now.
I might have given that impression, but actually they weren't. He did a lot of the palisade. He did dig many sections of the palisade, but the henge ditch itself, he only excavated at the 2 entrances to the north and to the west. So there's plenty more henge ditch there, and it's enormous. One of the interesting things that we found was that there are some burials in that ditch, which we dated some child burials, which were very, very low down in the ditch, but ended up being Iron Age in date, and there is some Iron Age occupation on the site. What's interesting is that in the Iron Age, they were burying these children pretty much at the base of the ditch. So that ditch was open as an enormous earthwork through to the Iron Age period. So this is a substantial thing. So yeah, there's plenty more of it. Yes, the site 4 was pretty much totally excavated. Quite a lot of the palisade was, but not much of the henge ditch and enclosure. And there may potentially be other things within the interior or around the outside that we haven't fully understood yet and haven't been excavated.
Okay, let's look. Steve asked whether there's any evidence of people moving from one of these henge sites, mega henges, from one to the other.
Not directly. Unfortunately, our techniques do not allow quite that precision, at least yet. There has been some interesting work by Richard Madgwick at Cardiff University on the isotopes for the animal bones, and he's looked at cattle and pig remains from Mount Pleasant and compared those to Durrington Walls near Stonehenge and Marden, and also West Kennet Palisades. And each of those sites shows the transport of animals, and therefore by implication we think people, from a variety of different geologies. And that's all we can say really, because the animal bones have a variety of geologies which suggest that people are coming to those areas from lots of different places, but it's very difficult using that technique to pinpoint a specific area. So you can say it's on the chalk, or you can say it's on older types of geology, but you can't say definitely these people were from Avebury or from Stonehenge or anything like that. We also don't have that many human remains. As I was saying, they're doing something a bit odd with their dead, which means they don't show up. So unfortunately, they're not there for us to look at in detail in terms of the isotopes of the people. But it wouldn't surprise me, because generally in the Neolithic, earlier on in the middle and in the early Neolithic, people seem to be moving around an awful lot. So I would imagine that if you were living in southern England, you would probably have seen all of these places and moved around them several times. But exactly how people moved between them and how it was all organized, yeah, don't know.
Okay, now I'm going to pose this question, but I'm not going to ask you to answer it, because this has been sort of raised elsewhere as well, and I think it is actually something that deserves its own special session. And I've just been talking to Alison Sheridan offline, about whether we do something about this in the autumn, which is about all those links between not just the monuments in southern Britain, but also farther afield to Orkney, and things like the dating of grooved ware and so on. So I would phrase that as Avebury versus Orkney.
Yeah,
But I
so
think perhaps that's going to be
that's a whole
that's a
other session,
whole
probably.
different topic. So
Yeah.
perhaps we might come to that in the autumn. It
Yeah,
strikes
that'd be
me as
great.
being
Yeah.
really quite an interesting time to do that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, my PhD research is also looking at the Irish and the Scottish evidence, but yeah, as you say, there's a whole lot of other things to talk about, and there are very different patterns in the chronology for those complexes, in terms of both the kind of intense period of building activity and ritual activity, and also when they sort of come to an end. So particularly in Orkney, we see quite an early end to the kind of major construction aspects of the monuments in that area, and the sites like Nessebrugge. And there, of course, you don't get the beaker, the presence until much later. So there's something very different going on with those. Yeah, I'm not sure I can cover that. I think Alison, I might have to defer to Alison with that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. The question is, how many people can we have talking at once on this? So yeah, so with that, I'm sort of looking forward to something else, and it'll be really fascinating to see that new research coming forward that I know you've talked about is sort of underway, and we know is sort of coming in other places. So absolutely fascinating. So can I say a very big thank you for absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you for everyone for joining us. Thank you to those of you who posed questions. I think we managed to get most of them in, and see everyone next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm afraid virtual applause, because I've still not cracked how to make how to do real applause on one of these things. It's the real trouble with these webinars. So thank you very much. And people on the chat are saying, yeah, just rolling through, people saying thank you, brilliant. Super talk, huge virtual applause, yeah, rolling in. So really interesting.
That's
Thanks.
Good. Thank you. Right, I'm going to go and have that well-deserved beer now.